what made Milarepa originally like a saint or famous, or like was he enlightened, or was he just like a famous teacher?
Well, that's a good question, and it changes over time. So by the time we see the standard version, the canonical version that many of you have read, he's held up as the sort of epitome, as an archetype for what a wandering yogin, what a meditator should be like. And readers would often think, historically and even today, would think, even if I can't practice that way now, I aspire to be able to meditate with that kind of fortitude in the future. Now, in the earliest records that we have, sort of written about maybe just after his death, it's a very different kind of thing. In fact, it really is as if we had handwritten notes of what someone's teacher had done and said. And they're really like fragmentary notes, as if you were taking notes of this lecture and then went and tried to reconstitute, what the lecture was from your own notes. And we don't really have the sense of a figure, Milarepa, as a saint so much just as an individual's teacher. Now, the question is kind of complicated. It's a good one, and it's complicated because there's no real translation in Tibetan, and maybe in other classical Buddhist languages, for the word saint. So the words that are used in Tibetan to describe Milarepa, well, one is jetsun. So jetsun is a term, it's difficult to translate. It's sometimes translated as the Venerable Lord. It's kind of a high title for a greatly esteemed teacher. Teacher who's understood as having kind of some realization in meditation. He's sometimes referred to as a yogin, as a Naljorpa, which refers mostly to his practice of meditation, to the years he spent in meditation. He's sometimes referred to by the word siddha, which is a Sanskrit word which refers to these kind of wild tantric figures, these kind of antinomian, transgressive figures who left society behind to sort of live in the wilderness. But there's nothing that really encapsulates the broad range of ideas and references that we have with the word saint. So it's a difficult question to answer in that way. But we definitely do see a progression from Mila as a sort of individual teacher to Mila as the sort of icon, as the paradigm of the religious practitioner. And also, I should say, as the founder of a lineage. So Mila is intimately connected as one of the founders of one of, well, what's now referred to as the four schools or the four sects of Tibetan Buddhism. And one of the sort of rationales, one of the agendas, you might say, of the life of Milarepa is to establish him in that position, to establish for the larger reading community where that lineage comes from, and the fact that it takes its source in such a great, powerful figure. Other questions? Yeah.
So when he made the Madman into untrue, true,
yeah,
unpure, pure, how do we have a sense of how he would actually go about that besides just saying, "Oh, I am Milarepa"? Well, this is my argument here that in the past, even both Tibetan writers historically and even modern commentators today, both Tibetan and Western scholars, have ubiquitously said that the life of Milarepa in this telling, in the standard version, is truer and realer because it was based on better sources, right? It was based on more valid sources. And what I've been able to do is looking at basically all of the earlier literature, saying, well, listen, it's just not true. I mean, basically, he copied verbatim in many cases exactly what was written before. So the claim that he makes himself that this is somehow an extraordinary life story that I've made, it's somehow different from the other one. And the claim that's made even by Tibetan interpreters, I think, has to be taken on different grounds. So it's not so much that he had different sources, but that its claim to legitimation, its claim to validity is formed through the voice of its author, right, and not through his sources. Other questions, comments, concerns, queries? Yeah.
You said this is popular throughout several countries. How has this contributed to the broader Buddhism outside?
You mean within Buddhist countries and like Buddhist Asia? It's funny, someone was just asking me about that as well. So the Life of Milarepa was translated for the first time into a European, well, it was first time it was translated at all was, I believe, in like 1679. It was translated into Mongolian. And the Mongolians were largely Tibetan Buddhists. So there you see a direct connection. It was translated for the first time in a European language in 1925 into French by Jacques Fasson, and then its first time into English in 1928. It was published in 1928. It was also translated into Chinese, I think, in the 1940s, into Japanese around the same time. My guess, though, is that, and my guess is that the Chinese and Japanese translators were working because they were interested in Tibetan Buddhism, not because their own traditions, that somehow Japanese or East Asian Buddhism or Southeast Asian Buddhism had some fascination with the figure of Milarepa. I think they probably didn't know much about him. But we do have a very interesting record. And this is from the late 1940s, written by a man named Gendon Chupel, and he's often referred to as the first Tibetan modernist. And he began his career as a monk and a scholar and a logician, a philosopher, and later renounced his vows, wandered all over India and South Asia, all the way to Sri Lanka, looking to gather Sanskrit manuscripts. And at one point, he even he wrote the Tibetan version of the Kama Sutra, kind of sexology manuscript, said to have been based on his own personal research. So he was an interesting figure. He's also an artist and a poet. But there's a story in which he encountered some monks in Sri Lanka, and he was telling them about the life of Milarepa. They were asking him, "What's your Buddhism all about? What is Buddhism in Tibet all about?" And of course, being a Tibetan, one of the main stories about Tibetan Buddhism is the life of Milarepa. So he told the story of this great meditator who, renounced his life, renounced even the monastery, and spent his years and years wandering in solitude, meditating in mountain caves and jungles and forests and things like that. And this Sri Lankan Theravada, very orthodox Buddhist monk, said, "Oh, you Tibetans practice very good Buddhism." And then he further explained what the actual practice is that Milarepa was undertaking, which are these kind of tantric practices that are wrapped up in this kind of sexual imagery and things like that. And the monk was kind of shocked and said, "Oh, no, you Tibetans really are not practicing good Buddhism at all." I think in one sense, in other Buddhist traditions, they could sort of relate to the ideal of the Yogin, the kind of wandering mendicant who sort of lives outside of society, who spends his life meditating. But in another sense, the tradition is still quite foreign because the traditions are really quite distinct. Yeah?
Well, the biography, the Madman's biography is written in Tibetan.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so it had a lot to do with, in a sense, the translation of an ideal Buddhist figure into a more vernacular medium, if you will. Which makes me think that this is a local version of Buddha, a much more accessible. Just like, the Zen masters in China, all that literature is written in a very localized, well, not localized, but a Chinese language as opposed to a traditional philosophical Indian language, which is, again, making native. So I would tend to think that it's not quite as translatable or exportable because of its accessibility to Tibetans.
Well, I would say that they're both true. I think you're absolutely right that this really was taking the story of the Buddha and making him Tibetan. I mean, there are many elements of the life of Milarepa I haven't described here that really are intentionally modeling the classic life of the Buddha. So it's a story told in 12 acts, and the life of the Buddha in Tibet is almost always told in 12 acts. And in fact, Tsongyi Maruka even says, and it's recorded in his biography, that he wants to model the life story and the life of the Buddha. And there's so many sort of tropes and particular incidents that mimic the life of the Buddha. I think that goes without saying. And they really are creating a kind of a Tibetan Buddha told within the structure of a Tibetan sutra. Now, that being said, I think there's something about the story itself as a piece of literature that really has translated, and I don't say anything about my own lack of skill as a translator, but it has translated remarkably well outside of Tibet. It's a story that really has captivated people from East Asia in contemporary times, in, say, the 20th century.